19. A few words more about Mrs. Humbert. While the going is good, a bad accident is to happen quite soon. I had been always aware of the possessive streak in her, but I never thought she would be so crazily jealous of anything in my life that had not been she. She showed a fierce, insatiable curiosity for my past. She desired me to resuscitate all my loves so that she might make me insult them, and trample upon them, and revoke them apostately and totally, thus destroying my past. She made me tell her about my marriage to Valeria, who was of course a scream, but I also had to invent, or to pad atrociously, a long series of mistresses for Charlotte's morbid delectation. To keep her happy, I had to present her with an illustrated catalogue of them, all nicely differentiated, according to the rules of those American ads where schoolchildren are pictured in a subtle ratio of races, with only one, but as cute as they make them, chocolate-colored round-eyed little lad, almost in the very middle of the front row. So I presented my women, and had them smile and sway, the languorous blonde, the fiery brunette, the sensual copperhead, as if on parade in a bordello. The more popular and platitudinous I made them, the more Mrs. Humbert was pleased with the show. Never in my life had I confessed so much or received so many confessions. The sincerity and artlessness with which she discussed what she called her love life, from first necking to connubial catch-as-catch-can, were, ethically, in striking contrast with my glib compositions, but technically the two sets were congeneric since both were affected by the same stuff. Soap operas, psychoanalysis and cheap novelettes, upon which I drew for my characters and she for her mode of expression. I was considerably amused by certain remarkable sexual habits that the good Harold Haze had according to Charlotte, who thought my mirth improper, but otherwise her autobiography was as devoid of interests as her autopsy would have been. I never saw a healthier woman than she, despite thinning diets. Of my Lolita she seldom spoke, more seldom, in fact, than she did of the blurred, blonde male baby whose photograph to the exclusion of all others adorned our bleak bedroom. In one of her tasteless reveries, she predicted that the dead infant's soul would return to earth in the form of the child she would bear in her present wedlock. And although I felt no special urge to supply the Humbert line with a replica of Harold's production, Lolita, with an incestuous thrill, I had grown to regard as my child, it occurred to me that a prolonged confinement, with a nice cesarean operation and other complications in a safe maternity ward sometime next spring, would give me a chance to be alone with my Lolita for weeks, perhaps, and gorge the limp nymphet with sleeping pills. Oh, she simply hated her daughter. What I thought especially vicious was that she had gone out of her way to answer with great diligence the questionnaires in a fool's book she had, A Guide to Your Child's Development, published in Chicago. The rigmarole went year by year, and Mom was supposed to fill out a kind of inventory at each of her child's birthdays. On Lowe's 12th, January 1, 1947, Charlotte Haze, née Becker, had underlined the following epithets, 10 out of 40. Under your child's personality: aggressive, boisterous, critical, distrustful, impatient, irritable, inquisitive, listless, negativistic, underlined twice, and obstinate. She had ignored the 30 remaining adjectives, among which were cheerful, cooperative, energetic, and so forth. It was really maddening. With a brutality that otherwise never appeared in my loving wife's mild nature, she attacked and routed such of Lowe's little belongings that had wandered to various parts of the house to freeze there like so many hypnotized bunnies. Little did the good lady dream that one morning, when an upset stomach, the result of my trying to improve on her sauces, had prevented me from accompanying her to church, I deceived her with one of Lolita's anklets. And then, her attitude toward my saporous darling's letters. Dear Mummy and Hummy, hope you are fine. Thank you very much for the candy. I, crossed out and rewritten again, I lost my new sweater in the woods. It has been cold here for the last few days. I'm having a time. Love, Dolly. The dumb child, said Mrs. Humbert, has left out a word before time. That sweater was all wool, and I wish you would not send her candy without consulting me. 20. There was a wood lake, Arglass Lake, not as I had thought it was spelled, a few miles from Ramsdale, and there was 1 week of great heat at the end of July when we drove there daily. I am now obliged to describe in some tedious detail our last swim there together, one tropical Tuesday morning. We had left the car in a parking area not far from the road and were making our way down a path cut through the pine forest to the lake, when Charlotte remarked that Jean Farlow, in quest of rare light effects, Jean belonged to the old school of painting, had seen Leslie taking a dip in the Ebony, as John had quipped, at 5 o'clock in the morning last Sunday. The water, I said, must have been quite cold. That is not the point, said the logical Doom dear. He is subnormal, you see. And, she continued, in that carefully phrased way of hers that was beginning to tell on my health, I have a very definite feeling our Louise is in love with that moron. Feeling. We feel Dolly is not doing as well, etc. from an old school report. The Humberts walked on, sandaled and robed. Do you know, I have one most ambitious dream, pronounced Lady Hum, lowering her head shy of that dream and communing with the tawny ground. I would love to get hold of a real trained servant maid like that German girl the Talbots spoke of, and have her live in the house. No room, I said. Come, she said with her quizzical smile, surely, Sherry, you underestimate the possibilities of the Humbert home. We would put her in Lowe's room. I intended to make a guest room of that hole anyway. It's the coldest and meanest in the whole house. What are you talking about? I asked, the skin of my cheekbones tensing up. This I take the trouble to note only because my daughter's skin did the same when she felt that way, disbelief, disgust, irritation. Are you bothered by romantic associations? Queried my wife in allusion to her first surrender. Hell no, said I. I just wonder where will you put your daughter when you get your guest or your maid? Ah, said Mrs. Humbert, dreaming, smiling, drawing out the ah simultaneously with the raise of one eyebrow and a soft exhalation of breath. Little Lo, I'm afraid, does not enter the picture at all, at all. Little Lo goes straight from camp to a good boarding school with strict discipline and some sound religious training. And then Beardsley College. I have it all mapped out, you need not worry. She went on to say that she, Mrs. Humbert, would have to overcome her habitual sloth and write to Miss Fallai's sister who taught at St. Algebra. The dazzling lake emerged. I said I had forgotten my sunglasses in the car and would catch up with her. I had always thought that wringing one's hands was a fictional gesture, the obscure outcome, perhaps, of some medieval ritual, but as I took to the woods, for a spell of despair and desperate meditation, this was the gesture. Look, Lord, at these chains, that would have come nearest to the mute expression of my mood. Had Charlotte been Valeria, I would have known how to handle the situation, and handle is the word I want. In the good old days, by merely twisting Fat Valak's brittle wrist, the one she had fallen upon from a bicycle, I could make her change her mind instantly, but anything of the sort in regard to Charlotte was unthinkable. Bland American Charlotte frightened me. My light-hearted dream of controlling her through her passion for me was all wrong. I dared not do anything to spoil the image of me she had set up to adore. I had toadied to her when she was the awesome duenna of my darling, and a groveling something still persisted in my attitude toward her. The only ace I held was her ignorance of my monstrous love for her Lo. She had been annoyed by Lo's liking me, but my feelings she could not divine. To Valeria I might have said, look here, you fat fool, c'est moi qui decide what is good for Dolores Humbert. To Charlotte, I could not even say, with ingratiating calm, excuse me, my dear, I disagree. Let us give the child one more chance. Let me be her private tutor for a year or so. You once told me yourself, in fact, I could not say anything at all to Charlotte about the child without giving myself away. Oh, you cannot imagine, as I had never imagined, what these women of principle are. Charlotte, who did not notice the falsity of all the everyday conventions and rules of behavior, and foods, and books, and people she doted upon, would distinguish at once a false intonation in anything I might say with a view to keeping Lo near. She was like a musician who may be an odious vulgarian in ordinary life, devoid of tact and taste, but who will hear a false note in music with diabolical accuracy of judgment. To break Charlotte's will, I would have to break her heart. If I broke her heart, her image of me would break too. If I said, either I have my way with Lolita, and you help me to keep the matter quiet, or we part at once, she would have turned as pale as a woman of clouded glass and slowly replied, all right, whatever you add or retract, this is the end. And the end it would be. Such, then, was the mess. I remember reaching the parking area and pumping a handful of rust-tasting water, and drinking it as avidly as if it would give me magic wisdom, youth, freedom, a tiny concubine. For a while, purple-robed, heel dangling, I sat on the edge of one of the rude tables, under the whooshing pines. In the middle distance, two little maidens in shorts and halters came out of a sun-dappled privy-marked women. Gum-chewing Mabel, or Mabel's understudy, laboriously, absent-mindedly straddled a bicycle, and Marian, shaking her hair because of the flies, settled behind, legs wide apart, and wobbling, they slowly, absently, merged with the light and shade. Lolita. Father and daughter melting into these woods. The natural solution was to destroy Mrs. Humbert. But how? No man can bring about the perfect murder. Chance, however, can do it. There was the famous dispatch of a Madame Lecoeur in Arles, southern France, at the close of last century. An unidentified bearded 6-footer, who, it was later conjectured, had been the lady's secret lover, walked up to her in a crowded street, soon after her marriage to Colonel Lecoeur, and mortally stabbed her in the back, 3 times, while the colonel, a small bulldog of a man, hung on to the murderer's arm. By a miraculous and beautiful coincidence, right at the moment when the operator was in the act of loosening the angry little husband's jaws, while several onlookers were closing in upon the group, a cranky Italian in the house nearest to the scene set off by sheer accident some kind of explosive he was tinkering with, and immediately the street was turned into a pandemonium of smoke, falling bricks and running people. The explosion hurt no one, except that it knocked out game Colonel Lecoeur, but the lady's vengeful lover ran when the others ran and lived happily ever after. Now look what happens when the operator himself plans a perfect removal. I walked down to Hourglass Lake. The spot from which we and a few other nice couples, the Farlows, the Chatfields, bathed was a kind of small cove. My Charlotte liked it because it was almost a private beach. The main bathing facilities, or drowning facilities as the Ramsdale Journal had had occasion to say, were in the eastern part of the Hourglass, and could not be seen from our coverlet. To our right, the pines soon gave way to a curve of marshland which turned again into forest on the opposite side. I sat down beside my wife so noiselessly that she started. "Shall we go in?" she asked. "We shall in a minute. Let me follow a train of thought." I thought. More than a minute passed. "All right. Come on." Was I on that train? "You certainly were." "I hope so," said Charlotte, entering the water. It soon reached the goose-flesh of her thick thighs, and then, joining her outstretched hands, shutting her mouth tight, very plain-faced in her black rubber headgear, Charlotte flung herself forward with a great splash. Slowly we swam out into the shimmer of the lake. On the opposite bank, at least 1,000 paces away, if one could walk across water, I could make out the tiny figures of 2 men working like beavers on their stretch of shore. I knew exactly who they were, a retired policeman of Polish descent and the retired plumber who owned most of the timber on that side of the lake. And I also knew they were engaged in building, just for the dismal fun of the thing, a wharf. The knocks that reached us seemed so much bigger than what could be distinguished of those dwarfs' arms and tools. Indeed, one suspected the director of those acrosonic effects to have been at odds with the puppet master, especially since the hefty crack of each diminutive blow lagged behind its visual version. The short white sand strip of our beach, from which by now we had gone a little way to reach deep water, was empty on weekday mornings. There was nobody around except those 2 tiny very busy figures on the opposite side, and a dark red private plane that droned overhead, and then disappeared in the blue. The setting was really perfect for a brisk bubbling murder, and here was the subtle point: the man of law and the man of water were just near enough to witness an accident and just far enough not to observe a crime. They were near enough to hear a distracted bather thrashing about and bellowing for somebody to come and help him save his drowning wife, and they were too far to distinguish, if they happened to look too soon, that the anything but distracted swimmer was finishing to tread his wife underfoot. I was not yet at that stage. I merely want to convey the ease of the act, the nicety of the setting. So there was Charlotte swimming on with dutiful awkwardness. She was a very mediocre mermaid, but not without a certain solemn pleasure, for was not her merman by her side? And as I watched, with the stark lucidity of a future recollection, trying to see things as you will remember having seen them, the glossy whiteness of her wet face so little tanned despite all her endeavors, and her pale lips, and her naked convex forehead, and the tight black cap, and the plump wet neck, I knew that all I had to do was to drop back, take a deep breath, then grab her by the ankle and rapidly dive with my captive corpse. I say corpse because surprise, panic and inexperience would cause her to inhale at once a lethal gallon of lake, while I would be able to hold on for at least a full minute, open-eyed underwater. The fatal gesture passed like the tail of a falling star across the blackness of the contemplated crime. It was like some dreadful silent ballet, the male dancer holding the ballerina by her foot and streaking down through watery twilight. I might come up for a mouthful of air while still holding her down, and then would dive again as many times as would be necessary, and only when the curtain came down on her for good, would I permit myself to yell for help. And when some 20 minutes later the two puppets steadily growing arrived in a rowboat, one half newly painted, poor Mrs. Humbert Humbert, the victim of a grand poor coronary occlusion, or both, would be standing on her head in the inky ooze, some 30 feet below the smiling surface of Hourglass Lake. Simple, was it not? But what d'ye know, folks, I just could not make myself do it. She swam beside me, a trustful and clumsy seal, and all the logic of passion screamed in my ear, now is the time. And, folks, I just couldn't. In silence I turned shoreward and gravely, dutifully, she also turned, and still hell screamed its counsel, and still I could not make myself drown the poor, slippery, big-bodied creature. The scream grew more and more remote as I realized the melancholy fact that neither tomorrow, nor Friday, nor any other day or night, could I make myself put her to death. Oh, I could visualize myself slapping Valeria's breasts out of alignment, or otherwise hurting her, and I could see myself, no less clearly, shooting her lover in the underbelly and making him say "Ack" and sit down. But I could not kill Charlotte, especially when things were on the whole not quite as hopeless, perhaps, as they seemed at first once on that miserable morning. Were I to catch her by her strong kicking foot, were I to see her amazed look, hear her awful voice, were I still to go through with the ordeal, her ghost would haunt me all my life. Perhaps if the year were 1447 instead of 1947, I might have hoodwinked my gentle nature by administering her some classical poison from a hollow agate, some tender philter of death. But in our middle-class nosy era it would not have come off the way it used to in the brocaded palaces of the past. Nowadays you have to be a scientist if you want to be a killer. No, I was neither. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the majority of sex offenders that hanker for some throbbing, sweet moaning, physical but not necessarily coital, relation with a girl-child, are innocuous, inadequate, passive, timid strangers who merely ask the community to allow them to pursue their practically harmless, so-called aberrant behavior, their little hot wet private acts of sexual deviation without the police and society cracking down upon them. We are not sex fiends. We do not rape as good soldiers do. We are unhappy, mild, dog-eyed gentlemen, sufficiently well integrated to control our urge in the presence of adults, but ready to give years and years of life for one chance to touch an amphet. Emphatically, no killers are we. Poets never kill. Oh, my poor Charlotte, Do not hate me in your eternal heaven among an eternal alchemy of asphalt and rubber and metal and stone, but thank God, not water, not water. Nonetheless, it was a very close shave, speaking quite objectively. And now comes the point of my perfect crime parable. We sat down on our towels in the thirsty sun. She looked around, loosened her bra, and turned over on her stomach to give her back a chance to be feasted upon. She said she loved me. She sighed deeply. She extended one arm and groped in the pocket of her robe for her cigarettes. She sat up and smoked. She examined her right shoulder. She kissed me heavily with open smoky mouth. Suddenly, down the sandbank behind us, from under the bushes and pines, a stone rolled, then another. "Those disgusting prying kids," said Charlotte, holding up her big bra to her breast and turning prone again. "I shall have to speak about that to Peter Krestovsky." From the debouchement of the trail came a rustle, a footfall, and Jean Farlow marched down with her easel and things. "You scared us," said Charlotte. Jean said she had been up there, in a place of green concealment, spying on nature. Spies are generally shot, trying to finish a lakescape, but it was no good. She had no talent whatever, which was quite true. "And have you ever tried painting, Humbert?" Charlotte, who was a little jealous of Jean, wanted to know if John was coming. He was. He was coming home for lunch today. He had dropped her on the way to Parkington and should be picking her up any time now. It was a grand morning. She always felt a traitor to Cavall and Melampus for leaving them roped on such gorgeous days. She sat down on the white sand between Charlotte and me. She wore shorts. Her long brown legs were about as attractive to me as those of a chestnut mare. She showed her gums when she smiled. "I almost put both of you into my lake," she said. "I even noticed something you overlooked. You," addressing Humbert, "had your wristwatch on." "Yes, sir, you had." "Waterproof," said Charlotte softly, making a fish mouth. Jean took my wrist upon her knee and examined Charlotte's gift, then put back Humbert's hand on the sand, palm up. "You could see anything that way," remarked Charlotte coquettishly. Jean sighed. "I once saw," she said, "two children, male and female, at sunset, right here, making love. Their shadows were giants. And I told you about Mr. Thompson at daybreak. Next time I expect to see fat old Diver in the ivory. He is really a freak, that man. Last time he told me a completely indecent story about his nephew." "It appears hello there," said John's voice. 21. My habit of being silent when displeased, or, more exactly, the cold and scaly quality of my displeased silence, used to frighten Valeria out of her wits. She used to whimper and wail, saying "Ski me ren fall, say kg ni say thorn koi tu pinces quan tu es kama." I tried being silent with Charlotte and she just chirped on, or chucked my silence under the chin. An astonishing woman. I would retire to my former room, now a regular studio, mumbling I had after all a learned opus to write, and cheerfully Charlotte went on beautifying the home, warbling on the telephone and writing letters. From my window, through the lacquered shiver of poplar leaves, I could see her crossing the street and contentedly mailing her letter to Miss Fallon's sister. The week of scattered showers and shadows which elapsed after our last visit to the motionless sands of Hourglass Lake was one of the gloomiest I can recall. Then came 2 or 3 dim rays of hope before the ultimate sunburst. It occurred to me that I had a fine brain in beautiful working order and that I might as well use it. If I dared not meddle with my wife's plans for her daughter, getting warmer and browner every day in the fair weather of hopeless distance, I could surely devise some general means to assert myself in a general way that might be later directed toward a particular occasion. One evening, Charlotte herself provided me with an opening. "I have a surprise for you," she said, looking at me with fond eyes over a spoonful of soup. "In the fall we two are going to England." I swallowed my spoonful, wiped my lips with pink paper, the cool rich linens of Marana Hotel, and said, "I have also a surprise for you, my dear. We two are not going to England." "Why, what's the matter?" she said, Looking with more surprise than I had counted upon at my hands, I was involuntarily folding and tearing and crushing and tearing again the innocent pink napkin. My smiling face set her somewhat at ease, however. "The matter is quite simple," I replied. "Even in the most harmonious of households, as ours is, not all decisions are taken by the female partner. There are certain things that the husband is there to decide. I can well imagine the thrill that you, a healthy American gal, must experience at crossing the Atlantic on the same ocean liner with Lady Bumble or Sam Bumble, the frozen meat king, or a Hollywood harlot. And I doubt not that you and I would make a pretty ad for the traveling agency when portrayed looking you, frankly starry-eyed, I, controlling my envious admiration at the palace sentries, or scarlet guards, or beaver eaters, or whatever they are called. But I happen to be allergic to Europe, including merry old England. As you well know, I have nothing but very sad associations with the old and rotting world. No colored ads in your magazines will change the situation." "My darling," said Charlotte. "I really know, wait a minute. The present matter is only incidental. I am concerned with a general trend. When you wanted me to spend my afternoon sunbathing on the lake instead of doing my work, I gladly gave in and became a bronzed glamour boy for your sake, instead of remaining a scholar and, well, an educator. When you lead me to bridge and bourbon with the charming Farlows, I meekly follow. No, please, wait. When you decorate your home, I do not interfere with your schemes. When you decide all kinds of matters, I may be incomplete, or impartial, let us say, disagreement, but I say nothing. I ignore the particular. I cannot ignore the general. I love being bossed by you, but every game has its rules. I am not cross. I am not cross at all. Don't do that. But I am one half of this household, and have a small but distinct voice." She had come to my side and had fallen on her knees and was slowly, but very vehemently, shaking her head and clawing at my trousers. She said she had never realized. She said I was her ruler and her god. She said Louise had gone, and let us make love right away. She said I must forgive her or she would die. This little incident filled me with considerable elation. I told her quietly that it was a matter not of asking forgiveness, but of changing one's ways, and I resolved to press my advantage and spend a good deal of time, aloof and moody, working at my book or at least pretending to work. The studio bed in my former room had long been converted into the sofa it had always been at heart, and Charlotte had warned me since the very beginning of our cohabitation that gradually the room would be turned into a regular writer's den. A couple of days after the British incident, I was sitting in a new and very comfortable easy chair, with a large volume in my lap, when Charlotte rapped with her ring finger and sauntered in. How different were her movements from those of my Lolita, when she used to visit me in her dear dirty blue jeans, smelling of orchards in Nympheland, awkward and fey, and dimly depraved, the lower buttons of her shirt unfastened. Let me tell you, however, something. Behind the brashness of little Haze, and the poise of big Haze, a trickle of shy life ran that tasted the same, that murmured the same. A great French doctor once told my father that in near relatives the faintest gastric gurgle has the same voice. So Charlotte sauntered in. She felt all was not well between us. I had pretended to fall asleep the night before, and the night before that, as soon as we had gone to bed, and had risen at dawn. Tenderly, she inquired if she were not interrupting. "Not at the moment," I said, turning volume C of the girl's encyclopedia around to examine a picture-printed bottom edge as printers say. Charlotte went up to a little table of imitation mahogany with a drawer. She put her hand upon it. The little table was ugly, no doubt, but it had done nothing to her. "I have always wanted to ask you," she said, businesslike, not coquettish, "why is this thing locked up? Do you want it in this room? It's so abominably uncouth." "Leave it alone," I said. "I was camping in Scandinavia. Is there a key? Hidden? Oh, locked up love letters." She gave me one of those wounded doe looks that irritated me so much, and then, Not quite knowing if I was serious, or how to keep up the conversation, stood for several slow pages: campus, Canada, candid camera, candy, peering at the window pane rather than through it, drumming upon it with sharp almond and rose fingernails. Presently, at canoeing or canvas back, she strolled up to my chair and sank down, tweedily, weightily, on its arm, inundating me with the perfume my first wife had used. "Would his lordship like to spend the fall here?" she asked, pointing with her little finger at an autumn view in a conservative eastern state. "Why?" Very distinctly and slowly. She shrugged. "Probably Harold used to take a vacation at that time. Open season." Conditional reflex on her part. "I think I know where that is," she said, still pointing. "There is a hotel I remember, Enchanted Hunters, quaint, isn't it? And the food is a dream. And nobody bothers anybody." She rubbed her cheek against my temple. "Valeria soon got over that. Is there anything special you would like for dinner, dear? John and Jean will drop in later." I answered with a grunt. She kissed me on my underlip, and, brightly saying she would bake a cake, a tradition subsisted from my lodging days that I adored her cakes, left me to my idleness. Carefully putting down the open book where she had sat, it attempted to send forth a rotation of waves, but an inserted pencil stopped the pages. I checked the hiding place of the key. Rather self-consciously it lay under the old expensive safety razor I had used before she bought me a much better and cheaper one. Was it the perfect hiding place there, under the razor, in the groove of its velvet-lined case? The case lay in a small trunk where I kept various business papers. Could I improve upon this? Remarkable how difficult it is to conceal things, especially when one's wife keeps monkeying with the furniture. 22. I think it was exactly a week after our last swim that the noon mail brought a reply from the second Miss Fallon. The lady wrote she had just returned to St. Algebra from her sister's funeral. Euphemia had never been the same after breaking that hip. As to the matter of Mrs. Humbert's daughter, she wished to report that it was too late to enroll her this year, but that she, the surviving Fallon, was practically certain that if Mr. and Mrs. Humbert brought Dolores over in January, her admittance might be arranged. Next day, after lunch, I went to see our doctor, a friendly fellow whose perfect bedside manner and complete reliance on a few patented drugs adequately masked his ignorance of, and indifference to, medical science. The fact that Lo would have to come back to Ramsdale was a treasure of anticipation. For this event I wanted to be fully prepared. I had in fact begun my campaign earlier, before Charlotte made that cruel decision of hers. I had to be sure when my lovely child arrived, that very night, and then night after night, until St. Algebra took her away from me, I would possess the means of putting two creatures to sleep so thoroughly that neither sound nor touch should rouse them. Throughout most of July I had been experimenting with various sleeping powders, trying them out on Charlotte, a great taker of pills. The last dose I had given her, she thought it was a tablet of mild bromides to anoint her nerves, had knocked her out for 4 solid hours. I had put the radio at full blast. I had blazed in her face an Elizabeth-like flashlight. I had pushed her, pinched her, prodded her, and nothing had disturbed the rhythm of her calm and powerful breathing. However, when I had done such a simple thing as kiss her, she had awakened at once, as fresh and strong as an octopus. I barely escaped. This would not do, I thought, had to get something still safer. At first, Dr. Byron did not seem to believe me when I said his last prescription was no match for my insomnia. He suggested I try again, and for a moment diverted my attention by showing me photographs of his family. He had a fascinating child of Dolly's age, but I saw through his tricks and insisted he prescribed the mightiest pill extant. He suggested I play golf, but finally agreed to give me something that, he said, would really work, and going to a cabinet, he produced a vial of violet blue capsules banded with dark purple at one end, which, he said, had just been placed on the market and were intended not for neurotics whom a draught of water could calm if properly administered, but only for great sleepless artists who had to die for a few hours in order to live for centuries. I love to fool doctors, and though inwardly rejoicing, pocketed the pills with a skeptical shrug. Incidentally, I had had to be careful with him. Once, in another connection, a stupid lapse on my part made me mention my last sanatorium, and I thought I saw the tips of his ears twitch. Being not at all keen for Charlotte or anybody else to know that period of my past, I had hastily explained that I had once done some research among the insane for a novel. But no matter, the old rogue certainly had a sweet girline. I left in great spirits. Steering my wife's car with one finger, I contentedly rolled homeward. Ramsdale had, after all, lots of charm. The cicadas whirred, the avenue had been freshly watered. Smoothly, almost silkily, I turned down into our steep little street. Everything was somehow so right that day. So blue and green. I knew the sun shone because my ignition key was reflected in the windshield, and I knew it was exactly 3:30 because the nurse who came to massage Miss opposite every afternoon was tripping down the narrow sidewalk in her white stockings and shoes. As usual, Junk's hysterical setter attacked me as I rolled downhill, and as usual, the local paper was lying on the porch where it had just been hurled by Kinney. The day before I had ended the regime of aloofness I had imposed upon myself, and now uttered a cheerful homecoming call as I opened the door of the living room. With her ream white nape and bronze bun to me, wearing the yellow blouse and maroon slacks she had on when I first met her, Charlotte sat at the corner bureau writing a letter. My hand still on the doorknob, I repeated my hearty cry. Her writing hand stopped. She sat still for a moment, then she slowly turned in her chair and rested her elbow on its curved back. Her face, disfigured by her emotion, was not a pretty sight as she stared at my legs and said, "The Haze woman, the big bitch, the old cat, the obnoxious mama, the old stupid Haze is no longer your dupe. She has." My fair accuser stopped, swallowing her venom and her tears. Whatever Humbert Humbert said or attempted to say is inessential. She went on, "You're a monster. You're a detestable, abominable, criminal fraud. If you come near I'll scream out the window. Get back." Again, whatever HH murmured may be omitted, I think. "I am leaving tonight. This is all yours. Only you'll never, never see that miserable brat again. Get out of this room." Reader, I did. I went up to the ex-semi-studio. Arms akimbo, I stood for a moment quite still and self-composed, surveying from the threshold the raped little table with its open drawer, a key hanging from the lock, 4 other household keys on the tabletop. I walked across the landing into the Humbert's bedroom, and calmly removed my diary from under her pillow into my pocket. Then I started to walk downstairs, but stopped halfway. She was talking on the telephone which happened to be plugged just outside the door of the living room. I wanted to hear what she was saying. She cancelled an order for something or other, and returned to the parlor. I rearranged my respiration and went through the hallway to the kitchen. There, I opened a bottle of scotch. She could never resist scotch. Then I walked into the dining room and from there, through the half-open door, contemplated Charlotte's broad back. "You are ruining my life and yours," I said quietly. "Let us be civilized people. It is all your hallucination. You are crazy, Charlotte. The notes you found were fragments of a novel. Your name and hers were put in by mere chance. Just because they came handy. Think it over. I shall bring you a drink." She neither answered nor turned, but went on writing in a scorching scrawl whatever she was writing. A third letter, presumably, 2 in stamped envelopes, were already laid out on the desk. I went back to the kitchen. I set out 2 glasses, to Saint Algebra? To Low? And opened the refrigerator. It roared at me viciously while I removed the ice from its heart. Rewrite. Let her read it again. She will not recall details. Change, forge. Write a fragment and show it to her or leave it lying around. Why do faucets sometimes whine so horribly? A horrible situation, really. The little pillow-shaped blocks of ice pillows for polar teddy bear, low emitted rasping, crackling, tortured sounds as the warm water loosened them in their cells. I bumped down the glasses side by side. I poured in the whiskey and a dram of soda. She had tabooed my pin. Bark and bang went the icebox. Carrying the glasses, I walked through the dining room and spoke through the parlor door, which was a fraction ajar, not quite space enough for my elbow. "I have made you a drink," I said. She did not answer, the mad bitch, and I placed the glasses on the sideboard near the telephone, which had started to ring. "Leslie speaking." "Leslie Thompson," said Leslie Thompson, who favored a dip at dawn. "Mrs. Humbert, sir, has been run over and you'd better come quick." I answered, perhaps a bit testily, that my wife was safe and sound, and still holding the receiver. I pushed open the door and said, "There's this man saying you've been killed, Charlotte." But there was no Charlotte in the living room. 23. I rushed out. The far side of our steep little street presented a peculiar sight. A big black glossy Packard had climbed Miss Opposite's sloping lawn at an angle from the sidewalk, where a tartan laprobe had dropped in a heap, and stood there, shining in the sun, its doors open like wings, its front wheels deep in evergreen shrubbery. To the anatomical right of this car, on the trim turn of the lawn slope, an old gentleman with a white mustache, well-dressed double-breasted gray suit, polka-dotted bow tie lay supine, his long legs together, like a death-size wax figure. I have to put the impact of an instantaneous vision into a sequence of words. Their physical accumulation in the page impairs the actual flash, the sharp unity of impression. Rug heap, car, old man doll, Miss O.'s nurse running with a rustle, a half-empty tumbler in her hand, back to the screened porch where the propped-up, imprisoned, decrepit lady herself may be imagined screeching, but not loud enough to drown the rhythmical yaps of the junk setter walking from group to group from a bunch of neighbors already collected on the sidewalk, near the bit of checked stuff, and back to the car which he had finally run to earth, and then to another group on the lawn, consisting of Leslie, two policemen and a sturdy man with tortoise-shell glasses. At this point, I should explain that the prompt appearance of the patrolman, hardly more than a minute after the accident, was due to their having been ticketing the illegally parked cars in a cross lane 2 blocks down the grade, that the fellow with the glasses was Frederick Beale Jr., driver of the Packard, that his 79-year-old father, whom the nurse had just watered on the green bank where he lay a banked banker so to speak, was not in a dead faint, but was comfortably and methodically recovering from a mild heart attack or its possibility, and, finally, that the laprobe on the sidewalk, where she had so often pointed out to me with disapproval the crooked green cracks, concealed the mangled remains of Charlotte Humbert, who had been knocked down and dragged several feet by the Beale car as she was hurrying across the street to drop 3 letters in the mailbox, at the corner of Miss Opposite's lawn. These were picked up and handed to me by a pretty child in a dirty pink frock, and I got rid of them by clawing them to fragments in my trouser pocket. 3 doctors and the Farlows presently arrived on the scene and took over. The widower, a man of exceptional self-control, neither wept nor raved. He staggered a bit, that he did, but he opened his mouth only to impart such information or issue such directions as were strictly necessary in connection with the identification, examination and disposal of a dead woman, the top of her head a porridge of bone, brains, bronze hair and blood. The sun was still a blinding red when he was put to bed in Dolly's room by his 2 friends, Gentle John and Dewy-eyed Jean, who, to be near, retired to the Humberts' bedroom for the night, which, for all I know, they may not have spent as innocently as the solemnity of the occasion required. I have no reason to dwell, in this very special memoir, on the pre-funeral formalities that had to be attended to, or on the funeral itself, which was as quiet as the marriage had been. But a few incidents pertaining to those 4 or 5 days after Charlotte's simple death, have to be noted. My first night of widowhood I was so drunk that I slept as soundly as the child who had slept in that bed. Next morning I hastened to inspect the fragments of letters in my pocket. They had got too thoroughly mixed up to be sorted into 3 complete sets. I assumed that. "And you had better find it because I cannot buy." Came from a letter to Lo, and other fragments seemed to point to Charlotte's intention of fleeing with Lo to Parkington, or even back to Pisky, lest the vulture snatch her precious lamb. Other tatters and shreds, "Never had I thought I had such strong talons," obviously referred to an application not to Street A but to another boarding school which was said to be so harsh and grey and gaunt in its methods, although supplying croquet under the elms, as to have earned the nickname of reformatory for young ladies. Finally, the third epistle was obviously addressed to me. I made out such items as, "After a year of separation we may. Oh, my dearest, oh my. Worse than if it had been a woman you kept." Or, "Maybe, I shall die." But on the whole my gleanings made little sense. The various fragments of those 3 hasty missives were as jumbled in the palms of my hands as their elements had been in poor Charlotte's head. That day John had to see a customer, and Jean had to feed her dogs, and so I was to be deprived temporarily of my friend's company. The dear people were afraid I might commit suicide if left alone, and since no other friends were available, Miss Opposite was incommunicado. The McCoos were busy building a new house miles away, and the Chatfields had been recently called to Maine by some family trouble of their own. Leslie and Louise were commissioned to keep me company under the pretense of helping me to sort out and pack a multitude of orphaned things. In a moment of superb inspiration I showed the kind and credulous Farlows, we were waiting for Leslie to come for his paid tryst with Louise, a little photograph of Charlotte I had found among her affairs. From a boulder she smiled through blown hair. It had been taken in April 1934, a memorable spring. While on a business visit to the States, I had had occasion to spend several months in Pisky. We met and had a mad love affair. I was married, alas, and she was engaged to Haze, but after I returned to Europe, we corresponded through a friend, now dead. Jean whispered she had heard some rumors and looked at the snapshot, and, still looking, handed it to John, and John removed his pipe and looked at lovely and fast Charlotte Becker, and handed it back to me. Then they left for a few hours. Happy Louise was gurgling and scolding her swain in the basement. Hardly had the Farlows gone than a blue-chinned cleric called and I tried to make the interview as brief as was consistent with neither hurting his feelings nor arousing his doubts. Yes, I would devote all my life to the child's welfare. Here, incidentally, was a little cross that Charlotte Becker had given me when we were both young. I had a female cousin, a respectable spinster in New York. There we would find a good private school for Dolly. Oh, what a crafty Humbert! For the benefit of Leslie and Louise who might, and did, report it to John and Jean, I made a tremendously loud and beautifully enacted long-distance call and simulated a conversation with Shirley Holmes. When John and Jean returned, I completely took them in by telling them, in a deliberately wild and confused mutter, that Lo had gone with the intermediate group on a 5-day hike and could not be reached. "Good Lord," said Jean, "what shall we do?" John said it was perfectly simple. He would get the Climax police to find the hikers. It would not take them an hour. In fact, he knew the country. And look, he continued, "why don't I drive there right now, and you may sleep with Jean." He did not really add that, but Jean supported his offer so passionately that it might be implied. I broke down. I pleaded with John to let things remain the way they were. I said I could not bear to have the child all around me, sobbing, clinging to me. She was so high-strung, the experience might react on her future. Psychiatrists have analyzed such cases. There was a sudden pause. "Well, you are the doctor," said John a little bluntly. "But after all, I was Charlotte's friend and advisor. One would like to know what you are going to do about the child anyway." "John," cried Jean, "she is his child, not Harold Haze's. Don't you understand? Humbert is Dolly's real father." "I see," said John. "I am sorry." "Yes. I see. I did not realize that. It simplifies matters, of course. And whatever you feel is right." The distraught father went on to say he would go and fetch his delicate daughter immediately after the funeral, and would do his best to give her a good time in totally different surroundings, perhaps a trip to New Mexico or California granted, of course, he lived. So artistically did I impersonate the calm of ultimate despair, the hush before some crazy outburst, that the perfect Farlows removed me to their house. They had a good cellar, as cellars go in this country, and that was helpful, for I feared insomnia and a ghost. Now I must explain my reasons for keeping Dolores away. Naturally, at first, when Charlotte had just been eliminated and I re-entered the house of Free Father, and gulped down the 2 whiskey and sodas I had prepared, and topped them with a pint or 2 of my pin, and went to the bathroom to get away from neighbors and friends, there was but one thing in my mind and pulse, namely, the awareness that a few hours hence, warm, brown-haired, and mine, Lolita would be in my arms, shedding tears that I would kiss away faster than they could well. But as I stood wide-eyed and flushed before the mirror, John Farlow tenderly tapped to inquire if I was okay, and I immediately realized it would be madness on my part to have her in the house with all those busybodies milling around and scheming to take her away from me. Indeed, unpredictable though herself might show some foolish distrust of me, a sudden repugnance, vague fear and the like, and gone would be the magic prize at the very instant of triumph. Speaking of busybodies, I had another visitor friend, Beale, the fellow who eliminated my wife. Stodgy and solemn, looking like a kind of assistant executioner, with his bulldog jowls, small black eyes, thickly rimmed glasses and conspicuous nostrils, he was ushered in by John, who then left us, closing the door upon us, with the utmost tact. Suavely saying he had twins in my stepdaughter's class, my grotesque visitor unrolled a large diagram he had made of the accident. It was, as my stepdaughter would have put it, a beaut, with all kinds of impressive arrows and dotted lines in varicolored inks. Mrs. H.'s trajectory was illustrated at several points by a series of those little outline figures, doll-like we career girl or walk used in statistics as visual aids. Very clearly and conclusively, this route came into contact with a boldly traced sinuous line representing 2 consecutive swerves, one which the Beale car made to avoid the junk dog not shown, and the second, a kind of exaggerated continuation of the first, meant to avert the tragedy. A very black cross indicated the spot where the trim little outline figure had at last come to rest on the sidewalk. I looked for some similar mark to denote the place on the embankment where my visitor's huge wax father had reclined, but there was none. That gentleman, however, had signed the document as a witness underneath the name of Leslie Thompson, Miss Opposite and a few other people. With his hummingbird pencil deftly and delicately flying from one point to another, Frederick demonstrated his absolute innocence and the recklessness of my wife. While he was in the act of avoiding the dog, she slipped on the freshly watered asphalt and plunged forward, whereas she should have flung herself not forward but backward. Fred showed how by a jerk of his padded shoulder. I said it was certainly not his fault, and the inquest upheld my view. Breathing violently through jet-black tense nostrils, he shook his head and my hand, then, with an air of perfect savoir-vivre and gentlemanly generosity, he offered to pay the funeral home expenses. He expected me to refuse his offer. With a drunken sob of gratitude I accepted it. This took him aback. Slowly, incredulously, he repeated what he had said. I thanked him again, even more profusely than before. In result of that weird interview, the numbness of my soul was for a moment resolved. And no wonder. I had actually seen the agent of fate. I had palpated the very flesh of fate and its padded shoulder. A brilliant and monstrous mutation had suddenly taken place, and here was the instrument. Within the intricacies of the pattern, hurrying housewife, slippery pavement, a pest of a dog, steep grade, big car, baboon at its wheel, I could dimly distinguish my own vile contribution. Had I not been such a fool or such an intuitive genius to preserve that journal, fluids produced by vindictive anger and hot shame would not have blinded Charlotte in her dash to the mailbox. But even had they blinded her, still nothing might have happened, had not precise fate, that synchronizing phantom, mixed within its alembic the car and the dog and the sun and the shade and the wet and the weak and the strong and the stone. Adieu, Marlene. Fat Fate's formal handshake, as reproduced by Beale before leaving the room, brought me out of my torpor, and I wept. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I wept.